Today we're going to look at the Quranic version of the story of Adam and Eve, and I've got it paired with a really kind of exquisite looking Chagall painting, very vibrant with blues and greens. But I love this painting because there's so much, it's so rich in like detail and symbols that we get from this kind of quilt of different creation stories. So we'll get back to the painting a little bit later in the unit. So what I want to do is kind of go through a little bit of the history of Islam and how we got to this point. So if we remember from our story of Genesis, we learned that Genesis was crafted over quite a bit of time. We usually place the earliest parts of this creation story sometime around 1000 BC, okay? And then maybe as early or as soon as 500 BC. So somewhere within that range, we have the crafting and the cobbling together of this story. Islam is a much younger religion, and by younger I mean it's more recent. And so if we look a little bit at the history of Islam in this particular work, the Qur'an, we see that Muhammad took his revelation sometime around the 6th or 7th century, about in the 600s AD, and even though he himself was illiterate, he began to gather followers who eventually would pin down his stories, much like Jesus. Jesus, we don't know about literacy. We do believe he was literate based on his ability to read scripture from the Torah. But we know that the Quran was actually written down much later. It was a religion that in its early stages was not much admired or liked very much by some of the Middle Eastern powers who seemed to be more content to be ruled by more tribal groups, clans, if you want to think of it that way, these strong families who were loosely following kind of a multi-god or a pagan system. And when Muhammad pronounced the idea of a single god, this monotheistic religion, it was not well taken, and so you had a split in the Middle Eastern community. The Quran is believed to be the divine revelation of God to Muhammad, and then as given to those who would write it down. Muhammad didn't write it, Muhammad spoke it. And so typically when you pick up a Quran, one of the first things that you'll read about it is that if you are reading this, you are not reading the Quran, because the Quran started as the spoken word that was being transmitted through Muhammad. So some differences you might find with other religions is this religion does not have a hierarchy. There's no structure to it in the form of we have a priest or nuns or brothers who then report maybe to a bishop, like you certainly have with Catholicism. So there's no scale. There's no one person who is given any kind of authority. You do have a series of clergy, and the clergy are considered to be more like teachers. They will give views and interpretations, but theoretically this is a religion that has no hierarchy, no clergy, no saints. There's nothing that stands between you and God, you as a believer in God. So they don't believe in an intermediary, any kind of like confession of sins, any of that. There's no idea of baptism within this religion. The idea is that judgment comes from God alone, and that your life, you're not born or predestined to be saved. God will judge you on the day, and he will make a decision about your fate. Currently, we've got roughly 1.2 billion Muslims worldwide compared to about 2.2 or 2.02 billion Christians. Those are by far the two largest religious segments. I'm going to get into like a belief system real quick. Islam is founded upon 5 pillars or supports. The pillars are not that different than many of you might find with Christianity. The first pillar involves a profession of faith in a single God, much like some Christians will talk about the Nicene Creed. They talk about this as an article of faith or a doctrine. They do not believe in a tripartite system where you might have a 3-part God like a Trinity. They see only a single God, and because of that they would recognize Christ as a good prophet, a good believer, a just man, but certainly not a God. Pillar 2 involves mandatory prayer, which occurs 5 times a day. You should be facing the holy city of Mecca. It should be part of your daily routine. And in that way, they are not that different than a lot of religions that suggest and expect prayer at certain times. Pillar 3 involves giving charity. Legally, the zakat is considered to be 1/40th of your income, which is quite a bit lower than some churches, which call for a tithe or a tenth. Giving alms or charity is completely voluntary. So the 4th pillar involves fasting, which is supposed to foster some sort of obedience and unity among the Muslims. It's done at particular days during the year, certainly the most famous being Ramadan, where you will fast from sunrise until sunset. And then lastly, the final pillar is a pilgrimage at least once in your lifetime, a holy Hajj to Mecca, the Holy Land. And this should be completed before your life ends. It's something you don't typically see in a lot of Christian religions, although people do travel to the Holy Land. People do make a pilgrimage to Rome. They do often visit holy sites where they believe miracles may have happened. But some of the differences, if you look at the basic pillars, nowhere in there is there a discussion about a jihad, which is certainly a part of Islam. But a jihad means striving in the path of God. Its definition is not a holy war. But if you want to think of it as a holy war, a jihad can be waged against something like poverty or ignorance or abuse. So a jihad is where you would have the entire, belief system, all Muslims agreeing to raise a jihad against something like poverty. Or it could be against a particular nation. It is a duty and it's imposed on the community as a whole rather than as an individual. So a single person cannot declare jihad and by himself go and do something. So it's a very different, I think the understanding of it is very different than what many people might think. So the jihad itself, while it does not teach that violence should be shunned, it also kind of ordains a peaceful, just system of tolerance, self-denial, charity, and mercy. And again, as you work your way through life, you will be judged ultimately by God. So you don't get to accumulate good things. You don't get to bear the baggage of bad things. You simply get to bear the judgment and the justness of God. So that's a real light look at Islam. You certainly can study it further. But for our purposes, what I really want to take a look at is the Qur'an, since that's the work we're going to be working from, and talk a little bit about the structure. So what's very different from what we see when you read a holy text like the Old Testament or like the New Testament, you often see kind of a chronological approach to things. The stories seem to be in order. There seems to be a logical movement forward. We don't have that in the Quran. Instead, what we get is kind of what's often called a ring cycle or a ring narrative. The Quran is made up of 114 chapters. Let me get this pen a little bit narrower. Okay. So we got 114 chapters. These chapters are called surahs. Okay. And they are not unified by a character. Okay. So for example, when we read the story of creation with Adam and Eve, we'll find that it appears in several different chapters, so it's spread out. Instead, the surahs are arranged more by topic or by theme. So as this kind of chart tries to illustrate for you, and this is typical of like a ring cycle or a ring story, what you get is a movement forward. So you have these initial chapters, which surahs 1 through 20 deal with the idea of faith versus unbelief and distinguishing what constitutes faith, what constitutes unbelief. And then we have some surahs that deal with Allah's creation, although it's not typically written in the way that you would expect. As like instead, stories of creation are interwoven, and they cross across time. So you might begin by talking about Adam and Eve, but then you might move to, another figure like Joseph, and then you might move back to Adam and Eve. So you see this constant like back and forth within there, and so you'll recognize stories in the Quran that are similar to stories that from the Old Testament, but they're arranged very differently. And so what you get is this almost mirror image as you flow across, and then you reach the back end or the final chapters of the Quran after that halfway point, that turning point, and you'll notice that there's almost a mirror image of the later chapters, okay, until we arrive at the end of the Quran where we're back to talking about faith versus unbelief. So as we look at the Quran, in the story of creation in particular, you'll notice that you'll see different chapter headings noted, and so let's just get into it, okay, as we go. All right. So here's a Quranic version of Adam and Eve, and again, it's mentioned in several places. God regarded man as his noblest creature. He sent him as his vice-regent upon the earth. Before creating Adam, he told the angels in heaven that he was creating man from clay, molding him from the earthly substance, and asked him to fall down before him in prostration. When I have given him form and breathed into him my spirit, the angels were aghast. They asked, "Pray, will you put man Will you put man there who will do mischief and shed blood? Why not send us instead, who worship and glorify you?" They prayed to the Lord not to humiliate them. God told them to obey his command, for he said, "You know not what I know." And the Quran says, so each one of them obeyed except Satan. God asked him, "Why did you not prostrate?" Satan replied, "Because I am worthier, my Lord, than Adam. Of fire you created me, and from clay you have created him." So what we have going on here is this kind of rebellion. So we talked a little bit before about Paradise Lost and this notion that Lucifer will rebel against God and then be cast out. And that's what we have being retold here. We've got a creation, but the angels are upset because they see themselves as higher in the pecking order. They don't want to worship man, and Satan certainly refuses to do that. So God thunders at him. Okay. "Be gone from my presence. There's no place for you here. Your arrogance makes you the meanest of my creatures." Satan bowed before the Lord and made one plea. "Grant me, my Lord, a reprieve until the day man is raised again." God granted Satan the reprieve. Satan then said, "Since you've thrown me out, I shall now waylay man on the straight path. You have laid him and made him commit sin, and from the right hand and from the left, and from behind him and from before him. You will not find in Adam and in most of his progeny gratitude for your bounties." So Satan gets God to make an agreement to let him stick around just until the Son of Man comes around. And God grants this curiously for no explicable reason. And of course, Satan does his work. Okay. God told Satan that he was disgraced, and he banished him from paradise. "And those of my creatures who follow you, they shall be consigned to hell with you." And do you notice that we started with Surah 2, verse 30, it jumped to Surah 7, verses 12, 13, 14, 7, and then suddenly we're ending with Surah number 20. So you can see that this is not meant to be a story that's told in chronologically in its whole. Instead, it's pieced together from many locations. So turning to Adam, God said, "You and Eve can reside in the Garden of Paradise. Eat fruits from any trees you like, but there is one to which you shall not go, nor shall you eat its fruits, for indeed it will be a transgression." Adam and Eve began to live blissfully in paradise, but Satan would tempt them so as to swerve them from the right path. He whispered into their ears that they should enjoy their bare bodies, which until then they had not perceived. He told them that their Lord had asked them to keep away from the prohibited tree because he did not wish them to become angels and thus immortal. So we see again the pride of Satan, who is reminding them that they're lower than the angels, which is not what God at first initially told them. So we'll stop here before we can get into the next video.